My name is Van. I'm actually I'm the general counsel and one of the directors, one member of the board of directors of the Python Software Foundation. For all of you who are working with Python, the Python Software Foundation is the group that essentially runs the infrastructure. If you download Python from python.org or you download packages from PyPI, we're the ones who actually run all of that infrastructure. Today, I was asked to talk a little bit about open source and free software and what it means for you. And so I want to start out just for a moment by saying, how many of you are familiar with the terms either open source or free software? Now, excellent. So we've got a background, a little bit of a background on this, but I want to go a little bit deeper, and I want to talk about the foundations of these concepts and why we're here and what we're doing. And so I've got a lot of things to go through. I'm going to talk pretty quickly, but I'm going to talk about these 4 things. And this is really about the background and why in the world do we do what we do, and what are the fundamental drivers. So the first thing is I want to talk about market economics, because with just a few exceptions, almost everything that we do is tied to this idea of a market. Now, you think of a market, you think going out and you buy food, you buy clothes, you buy all these other things. Yes, that is one example of a market, but a market really is, when you talk about it in economic terms, it's about exchange. It is about being able to, I give you one sort of good, and frequently that good is money, but not always, and you give me another. And when we exchange, we both get more of what we want, because if I give my money to someone and they give me a sandwich, well, I wanted that sandwich more than they wanted I wanted the money, and vice versa. And so we're both better off when we exchange. But in particular, I wanted to talk about this as this interplay of markets, which mean their preferences and incentives, and especially this idea of failures, market failure. So I talked about this idea of sandwiches, or actually maybe I'll use a banana. I'll use this example of a banana. When I say I really want a banana and I'm going to pay a certain amount for this banana, what I'm doing is I'm expressing preference, and a market is what allows us to exchange. And that person says, I want your money more than I want this banana that they've got. We exchange, that's the market. And there are things that we do in order to make certain types of interactions more or less likely. Those are incentives. The problem that happens is that when the incentives start to change, so that we take actions that don't end up actually being helpful for us and for the market in general. Those are what are known as market failures. So I'm going to be talking a lot about market failures. Okay, I'm going to need to move around. I'm going to be talking a lot about market failures in the context of information. Because when we're talking about Python, when we're talking about software, we're really talking about this concept of information and how it is used. So let's talk about what is unique about information. Well, the first thing is that information it's very costly to create. Now, when we go out, there's a lot of things that we do that create information. But when we think about information, when we think about software, when we think about something like Wikipedia or the local newspaper, those things, organizing, writing it down, communicating it, ends up being a very expensive proposition. But the problem is that once you put information together, it is very easy to copy or use that information. And so one of the problems with information and information economics is that you have the incentive to not create knowledge, because it is something that is very, very expensive to create. It's very easy for other people to take and copy. And so what happens is that you have this market failure. We don't create enough information. There was a famous saying that says, information wants to be free because it is so easy to share, and information wants to be so expensive because it's so hard to create. So that's the first problem with information. The second is information has unique characteristics when you talk about how you get value from it. When you create information, a lot of the value in information comes from keeping it secret. In particular, this is a particular secret that I like to keep. But it is not, because if I didn't keep that particular credit card number secret, well, it would necessarily cause me a lot of financial difficulties. But in particular, so information is valuable when you can use it exclusively. That is one of the main ways in which we create value through information. The problem is that information societally is more valuable when we use it, and we use it to build on top of other people's knowledge. That is how we create culture. That is how we create society, is by building on top of information that other people have developed. So again, we have this market failure because the incentive is to keep knowledge close, to not share it, when societally it actually helps us when that is what we do. So we have these evidences of market failures when we come to information. So let's look for a moment. What is it about information that leads to these particular outcomes, that leads to these market failures? And the answer is that information is classified as a public good. That is, information is something, you can classify information, or various types of goods, economic goods, through the way in which they interact with each other. A lot of goods are what they call rivalrous. Rivalrous means that only one person can have it at a time. If I've got a banana, you can't have that same banana. If I give it to you, then I've lost possession of it. Information is not like that. In fact, information, if I share it with you, that doesn't mean then everyone else still has it. The second thing is that information is not easily excludable. In fact, excludable means that basically I can keep you out. Think about a fence keeping you outside. You've got a nice park, you've got a swimming pool, you've got something like that. You can keep people out, and one of the ways in which people create value is by letting people in past this fence. Information is not excludable. In fact, there was the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, wrote this about information. He said, in fact, it is so easy for information to pass from person to person that says it forces itself into the possession of everyone, and the receiver cannot dispossess himself of it. That's an important and powerful thing, because as soon as you have that information in your hands, you cannot unlearn it. So what do we do? Well, something that is both non-rivalrous and non-excludable is known as a public good. And there's a classic problem with public goods that says we tend to have too few of them, because there's a famous thing called the free rider problem. The free rider problem basically says, if everyone else pays for this, then I don't have to actually contribute, and I can still get all of the benefit from whatever this good is. There are some famous public goods like clean air, clean water, a stable government, national security. These things are things that everybody benefits from, And it is hard to keep people out. They're not excludable, remember. And so there's an incentive for each person to not participate in the cost of creation for these public goods. But when we think about information as a public good, it is particularly difficult because information flies from person to person all over the world. And you're not just dealing with someone in a particular situation. For example, air quality, good air quality, one of the classic public goods, is something that is localized to a particular area. So you can get everybody in a particular city or country to care enough about air quality that they all band together and they say, we're going to join together, we're going to pass a law, we're going to pay our taxes, and we're going to solve this problem for ourselves. But information is inherently global, and so it has the public good, it has all the problems of a public good in abundance. So ultimately, we've got this problem with information, that the cost of creating it is high, the cost of consuming it, and the cost of sharing it is low. So what do? We also have the second problem, that secrets or knowledge that we keep to ourselves is actually more valuable for us personally, but societally it is more valuable when we share. So how do we solve this problem? How do we align the incentives? That's where we get this idea of intellectual property. Now, how many of you knew when I said I'm going to talk about open source and free software that I would end up at intellectual property, at least pass by it? A few people. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that the roots of open source are actually in intellectual property. It is what makes it work. Why is intellectual property so key to making open source work? Well, let's think about how do we create knowledge. There are algorithms for creating knowledge. For one of the easiest ways to do that is to just pay for it, to pay someone and have them do research, have them create something new. In fact, how many here are in the university? I know there's a lot of university students here. Raise your hands. You are participating in this type of knowledge creation. You are studying years of knowledge or information. And so you can think about it in terms of and law that allows you to realign the incentives associated with information in such a way that it allows people to embark in greater creation of information. How does it do this? Well, it's normally thought of as a bundle of rights, or some people sometimes say as a bundle of sticks. Each one of these is an independent thing that you're allowed to do with the information. So let's look, for example, at land. When you own some land, there are lots of different things that you're allowed to do with it. You're allowed to be on the land, you're allowed to drill in the land, you're allowed to build on the land, you're allowed to live there, you're allowed to do all these different things. And you can actually sell or rent out or give away all these different aspects of the land. For example, how many of you rent an apartment or rent a house? Quite a few people. You are actually engaging in a transaction where you don't own the land, but you've engaged in a transaction where you have the ability to reside and live on the land and exclude other people from it. That's the independence of these different rights. Well, intellectual property is similarly a bundle of sticks, a bundle of rights. This is from the U.S. Code, although it's broadly similar through something called the Berne Convention to what is recognized in copyright internationally. Here, you've got certain rights in the computer code that you create, the Python code that you create. The ability to copy it, the ability to adapt it and change it to what's called prepared derivative works, to distribute it, to display it, or to show it publicly. All these are independent rights. So what does this mean for intellectual property? It means that intellectual property, this hybrid good, gives you these powers to have exclusive rights over the information that you create. Okay, now we have the background to talk about open source. Now, I spoke for a moment about open source and free software, and in a lot of ways, they are very similar. And in fact, in almost all cases, if you find something that is free software, cap S, it's going to be open source, and if there's something that is open source, it's going to be free software. But these stance that says we should have the rights, regardless of intellectual property, to share with our neighbors, to share with others the things that we have learned, and that it is unethical for people to try and restrict that ability to share. Free software was created to harness intellectual property in the pursuit of that ethical end. Open source is a little bit different in that open source is not, we think about it as being part of a community. We think about it as being an algorithm for a development methodology. Open source is really about a set of legal tools for accomplishing free redistribution. So when we think about understanding open source, we need to look at the basis and say, what are these legal tools that it gives us? And here's the ultimate, the way that I want you to think about intellectual property. It's a free trade agreement. A free trade agreement? That's a little bit strange, isn't it? But if you think about trade, and you think about markets, we talked about exchanging all these things. Why do people engage in trade? They engage in trade because it makes each person better off. And it is easy to do. Now, sometimes people say, I think that I'm going to be a little bit better off if I put barriers, I put money between this exchange. Governments frequently do this. But really, free trade agreements are about what are the rules that allow us to cooperate. Open source is what allows us to do that. And in particular, it is free trade in ideas. How many of you have ever heard of the phrase, the marketplace of ideas? A few people have heard of that. Open source is the literal marketplace of ideas. You take ideas and you crystallize them down into executable code, and you share it. You create a market in it. It is literally your ideas being traded back and forth. And the reason why it is so powerful is because it allows us to participate in the gains from trade far more powerfully than any other mechanism that we now know. In fact, there are lots of different ways in which you can emphasize knowledge creation. But open source and free software have come out of practically nowhere and have completely dominated software development. And why have they done that? Because they are simply the most effective way to build on top of other people's ideas that we know. Economically, it is so much more efficient that it creates a platform for you to do more and be more than anything else. So, but if we're talking about free trade, IP law is about excluding others. It is not about sharing. It is not about free software. So how does IP law create the ability to have open source? Well, it turns out that we use licenses. Now, In particular, this is not about all licenses. This is particularly about open source licenses, which have a very specific definition. If you want to go see it, you can look at opensource.org/OSD. OSD stands for the open source definition. And in particular, the open source definition has a set of 10 items that are required for every single open source license to be certified as an open source license. What this does is it allows us to deal with, to exchange all these ideas, exchange all this code. The problem, though, is that you have this idea of free riders, because you take away the ability to exclude. So how does open source deal with free riders? Well, for that we need to talk a little bit about how open source licenses align the incentives, and we do that through the idea of game. It's a study of incentives and interactions, and how the things that you do, how the interactions between people tend to play out, and the incentives that they have. It is about what guides us to particular knowledge and guides us to particular choices, and what rewards we get, what response we get from different choices. So there are two broad sets of games. These are types of interactions in game theory. One are called zero-sum games, and one are called non-zero-sum games. Now, the difference between a zero-sum game and a non-zero-sum game is that in a zero-sum game, every time someone gains something, another person loses. And every time the converse is not true, but you can't have a gain without a corresponding loss. Where a non-zero-sum game is this magical thing where when two people participate in this type of interaction, they both come out of it better. That's an amazing thing. They both come out better. There's a famous game, in fact, illustrating this, called The Prisoner's Dilemma. Now it goes something like this. You have two prisoners, say they're both thieves or something, and the police come to each of them individually, and they say something like, if you confess, I'll give you a slap on the wrist and then let you go free. But if your partner confesses before you do, I'll give him I'll let him, get the slap on the wrist and go free, and you will have to pay. And so the person who defects gets a better deal, and the person who cooperates when the other person defects gets a bad deal. But here's the thing: is that if both people cooperate, then they don't have enough. They say, well, then we can't condemn either of you. Maybe they get something, but they both actually get the benefit. This is usually described as through this idea of a decision matrix. Here's the decision matrix for a classical prisoner's dilemma up on the screen, in where it says, if they both cooperate, if they both cooperate, you are actually in this scenario. So if they both cooperate, they both get a small punishment. However, if the prisoner A defects, he gets no punishment, and he gets no punishment, and the prisoner B, so they both defect, they get a punishment. However, the person, if one cooperates and one defects, you get this asymmetrical payoff. So what happens here is that we have a similar thing that goes on with open source software. In particular, you have this idea of, what am I going to do when I share my code? Are other people just going to take my code and do whatever they want with it? That's the programmer's version of the prisoner's dilemma. Because remember, this idea is that we share, and if we share, we're both better off. But if I share and you just take it and you say thanks, and you go away and you never share back, then that person's better off, but you've already paid the price for this knowledge creation. So this is the programmer's version of the prisoner's dilemma. What open source does is it helps us deal with this problem of what's called sub-optimization. Sub-optimization basically says you have two different outcomes. One is this local maximum, and one is the global maximum. It's easy to get caught here, but if there's some way to get past this low point, everybody would be better if we were up here. So how do we do this? Well, the answer is that open source allows us to change the game. In particular, it allows us to do this by changing the payoff matrix. The first thing we do is we signal that we're willing to cooperate. That's what we do when we put an open source license on our code. The second thing is that, like I said, we alter the payoff matrix. We make it so that it is more difficult or more costly for people to defect. In particular, open source licenses, and I'm going to be talking about what are called reciprocal licenses here, take effect when people defect. So what happens is that reciprocal open source licenses, they say, you know what, if you are going to, we're going to use the mechanisms of the law to say, if you take this code and you just walk away with it, and you don't share it with others, we're going to use the mechanisms of the law to punish you. We're going to change the payoff matrix so that actually what happens is that you end up with the globally optimal solution as being the thing that is encouraged for everybody, because everybody wants to avoid the copyright violation, a copyright violation, which is a large negative, opens you up to a lawsuit. It's a large negative outcome. So what does that mean when we go out into the wild? Well, I mentioned the open source definition. This is the first element of the open source definition. It talks about we are going to make sure that we don't restrict anybody. And look particularly at this rationale right here, where they say, by constraining the license to require free distribution, we try to avoid these poor incentives. If we didn't do this, there would be lots of pressure for cooperators to defect. This game theory describes what open source licenses are and why they work. As for you, the result is that you get knowledge creation unbounded and more effective than anything else than any other system that we've ever come up with. So now that we've got this idea that open source is about knowledge creation, how do you make it work for you? You need to think about it in terms of this is a huge opportunity for you to stand, they sometimes say, stand on top of the shoulders of giants. When we're talking about Python, for example, sometimes we had an estimate done a couple years ago where the Python runtime itself is estimated to be of several $100 million of equivalent value if we had to say, all right, we're just going to pay a bunch of people to create this. The larger ecosystem, every time you download code, there's a lot of people here for AI. TensorFlow is open source. PyTorch is open source. Pandas is open source. NumPy is open source. All of these things, collectively, the value runs into the billions of dollars that you get to sit on top of. So your opportunity is to say, I'm going to take this and I can create new knowledge on top of it, either through development in Python or through development in AI. It allows you to innovate from a higher level than any before. It allows you to say, I am going to create mind share and market share because I'm doing something new that I couldn't ever do before. It gives you it gives you the ability to reduce risk because you have the control over what you're doing. No one can keep it from you. If there's a problem, you can solve it yourself. For any of you who are in companies, there's going to be this job board downstairs. Open source is a powerful way to recruit, to retrain, and develop. And ultimately, this is tremendously important for a lot of people, but it ends up long-term being one of the least important things. It makes it so that it is a lot less costly to develop products and knowledge to share with others. So, I want to share one last thing before I go. When we are here at Pycon PK, Mashoud, talk for a minute. Why are you here? I'd like to challenge you to not only think about that, but to think about this in terms of your ability to contribute back. Open source and free software is meaningful because what it does is it allows us to share in the knowledge and the capabilities with each other and to build each other up. That happens when we cooperate, that happens when we share, when we contribute to each other. So I would encourage you all to say, don't be here just to take. Don't defect. Be here to contribute. Because the paradoxical thing is that when you contribute, you gain even more. That's the non-zero-sum game. When you become part of the community, when you are good to others, you share, you create knowledge, you create value, and you share it with others, it raises us all up. Thanks.